All right. Hi, Peter. Hi, Johnny. Hi, Ron. Thank you so much for joining me here today on Vonvo.com to discuss gun control in America and specifically prevention of gun violence and sensible gun control legislation. Just before we get our conversation started, I wanted to go over two quick things. The first is that right now this conversation is being recorded, and after the recording is completed, we'll be uploading this video to the internet to our YouTube channel. Is that okay with all three of you?
Yes. Sure.
Cool. And then on top of that, here at Vonvo, we're all about our discussions staying both civil and valuable. We don't want there to be any personal attacks against one another inside the chat room. Is that okay with all three of you?
All three of you? Of course. That's fine. Definitely.
Perfect. So let's get our conversation started. If we could each just give a quick introduction about one another and why you're so passionate about this topic. Peter, maybe I'll have Ron and Johnny go first just because they're new, and then you can give a quick little background right afterwards, Peter, because you've been on the program a few times. So Ron, do you want to just go ahead quickly so that for anyone who watches this video knows who you are? And then Johnny, and then Peter quickly.
Sure. My name is Dr. Ron Leone. I work in the law enforcement, and I believe in the Constitution, the way it's written.
Okay, great. Johnny? Johnny, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
So do you want to just give a quick background of yourself and why you're so passionate about this topic as well?
Sure. So I'm Johnny Moskowitz. I'm an instructor at Yale College in California. I'm about this because I think when it comes down to it, most people find themselves somewhere in the middle of the debate. And I think when the conversation about gun control should not be about gun control, say it should be how can we reduce gun violence. I think that's a better question than gun control.
Great. And Peter, you can give a quick background, then we'll begin.
Okay, my name is Peter. I'm a U.S. citizen living abroad at present. I've lived out of the country for over 30 years. I'm originally from the south side of Chicago, and by the time I was 25, I knew, and to this day, in some respects, know more people that have been victims of gun violence, either through direct violence or as a result of suicide. And I'm a proponent for stronger gun control while still maintaining the principles of the Second Amendment. Got a fairly firm background in law and law-related things, family that are very deeply involved in the law, and take that perspective on the issues.
Right. Great. So, Johnny, in terms of, you guys hear me okay?
There's a little bit of background noise.
Okay. It might be just if someone's echoing a bit, then you could just mute their camera and then unmute them when they're speaking. But basically, what I was going to say, Johnny, is in terms of prevention of gun violence. I mean, what are some practical steps that immediately come to your mind of how that can be done? And then Ron and Peter can chime in off of that.
Okay, so first of all, I think any laws that are made need to keep in mind that law-abiding citizens are not the problem. And I think, Peter, you've said this before, that the majority of gun owners are good people that are never going to hurt anybody. They're not the problem. But a lot of gun violence, a lot of gun deaths are caused by accident or negligence. So I think there are certain laws that we can institute that could potentially prevent some of that. For example, I'm an advocate of regulating gun purchases more like the DMV. To be able to get a license to drive, you have to pass a safety test, and you have to still always obey the law. And if you don't, there are going to be penalties. And I think we we should regulate the purchase of guns in a similar manner to that.
Great. Ron, do you have any input on that, or something you'd like to add on top of that, or?
I actually like John's thought about being able to and it's hard to define it, but classify who and who does not get the weapons. Recently, we've had a lot of things happen when it comes to people with mental health issues. The question is, how do you not allow them access to weapons? In other words, who's going to be the deciding factor as to whether or not someone has a mental health issue, thereby disallowing them the Second Amendment right?
Because I think we're all three of us probably leaning towards something along the lines, given that there's lots of protest against the idea of registries and the rest of it. I'd point out that there is in fact a registry that exists right now for fully automatic machine guns that has existed for 70 years with no problem. So on one level, there's not an issue there. So certainly one of the thoughts I've had with respect to background, you've got some very basic, obviously, the felony convictions. That's a no-brainer in terms of follow-up and checking through, and perhaps some expansion on the amount of time that the ATF has access to that information for the purpose of tracing crime guns, or some opportunity to deal with that. With respect to mental health and some of the other areas that may help to reduce violence overall, there's been a couple of studies with respect to, for example, to repetitive misdemeanor offenders, people, for example, who are convicted of vandalism, graffiti, those kinds of things, and that there's a fairly high propensity towards later gun violence. So you get juvenile offenders that are active in that respect, and people who get into bar fights or quarrels and have the police called on them all the time because their dog barks too much. People with a general disregard for the law. So, and with mental health, the thought that has crossed my mind is perhaps not an out-and-out, you can't have it on the first go-around, but a more thorough, in-depth examination of who you are with some interviews. In the past, prior to the Republican domination of the Missouri political structure, they had what was called a permit to purchase, where an individual had to make an appearance at the police station to acquire a license to purchase, and that struck me as a fairly reasonable approach. You go in and sit down and talk with the police officer and get interviewed accordingly. If there's a question as to who you are and what you're about. I mean, the basic background check for a law-abiding citizen is a quick study, but if there is a red flag, then perhaps you have to make an appearance someplace and have a little chit-chat.
Right.
What's your feeling on that?
Johnny, you want to respond? Or we kind of go in
So I like that idea. And Ron, you mentioned the mental health issue. How are we going to determine what's a dangerous mental health issue versus just something else? And I think that's indicative of a larger problem in the country, and the fact that the majority of gun deaths are because of suicide. And I think to reduce this problem, it's going to take a lot more than just regulations and some gun laws. To reduce the gun violence, we're going to have to increase our ability to help people. I'm very passionate about this because I come from a family of therapists. And so I think one step that we could take is to make it easier to have access to mental health care professionals. And I also don't think one mental health professional should be able to say this person doesn't deserve a gun. I think it should be if somebody is a problem that has been seen by multiple people, that would be a step to say this person is unstable and shouldn't be able to purchase a weapon. Am I making sense?
Okay, so more on the basis of a panel or on a sequential series of interviews?
A sequential series. I would
Series.
would be better.
And certainly, with respect to the suicide issue, I'm struck that your cigarette packs right now. There's more warning labels on cigarette packs than there is advertising, and I think, and certainly in all the discussions I've had with a number of very strong pro-gun advocates, is that there's a real level of ignorance about the fact that of the 30,000 deaths, just over 19,000 are related to firearm suicide and the circumstances within which that happens. And going back to our background check issue, there is the element of the domestic intimate murder-suicide, which is a portion of that 19,000, and that's a specific group, and there's a specific set of background check-related backstops that could interfere with that group. But the larger scale of it is, I just think, a lack of public knowledge and perhaps longer waiting periods with respect to the acquisition. The statistics suggest that it's a fairly high percentage. I don't have the number exactly at my fingertips, but a fairly high percentage of firearm suicides take place with a firearm that has been purchased within the year, and that the amount of time between the decision to commit suicide and the act of trying to commit suicide, according to survivors of suicide, is about an hour. So it strikes me that the trick is to try and provide the individuals that may find themselves in a high-stress scenario with the access to prevention lines and various support. Now, obviously, individuals won't necessarily go there, but if they're aware that they're at risk, they may.
Right.
Anybody who's dealt with anybody with depression will recognize that if you know you've got the problem, you may think it through a little bit more before you take the step.
Right.
What are your thoughts, Ron?
I don't have an issue with felons or people diagnosed with mental health disorders not having access to weapons. The question is, how do you define someone with a mental health disorder? Is it a panel? Is it an individual person several times being sought? That's a whole other issue. As far as it being a way of suicide or not, that I've worked in the prisons. If somebody wants to kill themselves, they're going to do it one way or another. It's that simple. Regardless of a firearm or not a firearm, it doesn't matter. If somebody wants to do away with themselves, they're going to do it.
So the latest that I have read actually would indicate something different. It says that, and every suicide is going to be different, but the latest I read was that a lot of suicides are impulsive, meaning that if they attempt suicide and it fails, and then they get the help, they won't try to kill themselves again. And so the gun would make it a lot easier for that to happen. And I'm not saying that because somebody is going to kill himself, we should prevent from getting a gun. It's one thing to consider. And when it comes to determine,
there's plenty of people without firearms that kill themselves.
You're absolutely right.
The numbers. There is more recently, actually, there's a couple of interesting developments with respect to suicide. There's been a dramatic rise in suicides in the 35 to 65-year-old age group in the last several years, both among men and women and across racial groupings, although predominantly white individuals, or non-Hispanic whites, I guess is how they define it. I mean, the fact is, firearm suicide is 95% effective. A number of other suicide attempts and methods can take up to 10 attempts, and as Johnny's pointing out, it is in some levels impulsive, and on other levels, certainly the general public perception is it's a cry for help. So there is the question.
So what are you debating? The efficiency level?
Well, no. I guess what I'm debating is not blowing it off as saying, because because someone may attempt to commit suicide, they'll be successful committing suicide. I think there's kind of a twofold thing. I agree with John's premise that you can't deny someone access to a firearm because they run the risk of suicide. That is a self-determining event. They are not. I mean, the only place where I would change that is with respect to the domestic violence issue. You know, I think there are fairly strong reasons to prohibit access to firearms during that particular period of time in people's lives. But I think it's a case of greater public education with respect to the families of other individuals and with respect to the individual themselves in terms of access to information. Right now, it's kind of the black sheep cousin of the whole issue. We have all this discussion about, you know, AR-15s and Newtown and all this stuff, where the focus is on the rather dramatic aspect. But the bulk of firearm-related death is, in fact, suicide. And it is, internationally, we are leading the world 3 or 4 times to 1 on that. And certainly, you know, we ought to be able to do better. And most of it is preventative, and most of it is towards helping identify what the risk factors might be. And that goes on to dealing with the CDC and the limitations on their ability to study things that needs to be addressed too on the writers. But the basics is, I think, information and education.
Part of the mental health people are going to tell you that just the issue of contemplating suicide puts it in the category of mental health issues.
True, depression and those things.
I mean, I've even when I was a young child, some people, especially one in our neighborhood, used a rifle to kill himself. He had terminal cancer. That was his way out.
Yeah, no, and certainly, and there's some fairly significant red flags of divorce, loss of a job, substance abuse, various issues that might suggest cancer. Certainly, a diagnosis, particularly among a young person or a fairly active person, depression as a general state, schizophrenia, those kinds of and I would expect that within. I know, for example, I suffer from a type of migraine headache called a cluster headache. I'm fortunate enough not to have them for a long time, but they are a particularly violent version of the migraine. And I know that among sufferers of that, there have been a fairly high number of suicides. So I suspect that with depression and schizophrenia and with all these different mental health issues, there are gradations of seriousness, and as people digress more and more into a state, and Johnny, your family, you say, are therapists, I would expect, we call them class 1, class 2, class 3 type of issues, and at some point you cross a line, and perhaps that's the point, Ron, where the system says, no, you are disqualified because you crossed this particular threshold, whatever the analysis says it is.
Here's my biggest issue. We all understand what the Second Amendment states, correct?
Yes, but we don't necessarily all agree on what it actually means.
Oh, okay. All right, that's fine.
No, but yes, we all understand what it says.
All I'm saying is that if you don't like the Second Amendment, the way it's written, there is a procedure to change it. Simply follow that procedure. Uphold and obey the law of the land.
Yeah, but I don't think that's necessary. If you look at the actual judicial history behind the Second Amendment, it's fairly clear.
It's the law of the land. How can it not be necessary?
Well, no.
When a president takes an oath, he swears an oath.
Yeah.
He swears an oath to uphold the Constitution, not parts and portions of the Constitution, thereby ignoring the other parts.
But that applies.
You swore an oath to uphold the entire Constitution.
Can I jump in?
If you don't like the Constitution, change it.
Okay.
Yes, John.
So the Second Amendment says that the right to bear arms should not be infringed. We know that. But the thing about the Constitution is there are limits to the clauses and to the amendments. I'll use the First Amendment example. You have a right to free speech, but you can't commit libel. Okay. You have a right to freedom of religion, but you can't infringe on other people's rights. So the right to bear arms cannot be infringed, but there's nothing in the Constitution that says that the sale of firearms cannot be regulated. So I agree with you that we shouldn't be trying to ban all guns, or especially law-abiding citizens, but
it doesn't say guns.
I don't agree with the idea of provisions because of the statement that says the right to bear arms shall not be infringed.
The trick is it doesn't say guns.
No, but it also doesn't.
It says arms.
Right, but it also
anything can be an arm.
What it says is a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary for the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. Those
underline, highlight that word infringed.
But those commas have meaning. You can't read it, the right of the people cannot be infringed. There's a comma there. It is the right of the people with respect to the militia, and the Constitution is quite clear on militia, and was followed by the Militia Act in the 1790s or whenever it was. The point is that the most recent decision from the courts with respect to the Second Amendment Chicago with respect to applying the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection of Law for the right to self-defense of the home. So that is the premise. So where we run into Second Amendment issues is on our interpretation of where the individual citizen can bear arms. I'm not in dispute that law-abiding individuals that have a reason for a purpose to bear arms, and there's all kinds of people whose work requires security. I have no issue with somebody being given a concealed carry.
Who decides the reason and the purpose?
Pardon? Well, regulated. The structure of the militia.
With the reason and the purpose.
The structure of them, but the Constitution is quite clear on who decides that. The Constitution decides that Congress decides in who and what, and the states administer and are authorized to do the training under the direction of Congress. If you read the Constitution,
so right now there may not be anybody that decides that, and that may be part of the problem.
Well, the courts are deciding. As the issues arise, the courts are deciding.
Yeah,
and that's
and Ron made the point though, who's going to decide who can have a gun, who's dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. And we may need.
Who decides who's mental health?
Well, so I'll get to that in a second. But what we may need an independent body, independent from the government, that regulates this, that certifies.
No, sorry, we already have it.
Yeah.
Independent from the government doesn't work.
Yeah, no, we already have it. We already have it within.
That's
going to
go by who's ever in power at the time.
Right. No, the ATF is the authority that determines whether or not somebody's qualified to acquire a firearm, and they do it under the guidelines of whatever the regulations are at the time. I think that I think the idea of sequential review of people where there's a question with respect to health issues is one thing. I think that an examination of some of the variables that might expand the criteria for disqualification, and they're not criteria that are going to interfere with law-abiding individuals. They're criteria that, if we've got somebody who's got chronic alcoholism problems and has been fired from work because of alcohol, it's given the propensity for people, or the presence, let me rephrase that, given the presence of alcohol in a number of the accidents and arguments and situations in which have resulted in either an injury or fatality with a firearm, and a fairly significant number of homicides are just arguments. that take place between parties that know each other, and alcohol plays a considerable role in that, and substance abuse plays a considerable role in that. So there may be areas at which one can look at. I think the principal element, though, with respect to crime guns is commercial sales and background checks. It's not whether your uncle wants to or your father wants to give you the family heirloom gun. That's a little concern. If it's already in the household, it's already in the household. It's when you want to go and sell your gun to the next door neighbor that just for the sake of because it's a commercial activity or a trade, that it passed through the scrutiny of third-party review by way of a background check, just to ensure that your neighbor is not the next, Ted Bundy, or whatever.
So let me ask you a question. Somehow we're stuck on guns again. So if I want to sell my neighbor a machete or a hammer, do I have to go through the same check?
No.
They can be arms.
Yes, they can be arms, but that's a facile argument, though, because machetes and hammers, again, we're dealing with blunt instrument homicide is about 300 and some a year, right? Knives, I'd have to look at the specifics of it. We're talking about 30,000 deaths a year, of which 12,000 are homicide, of which about 8,500 are firearm related. The vast majority take place with pistols. There is some evidence of the use of rifles and shotguns, and there's a whole number that don't get identified. The fact is that the homicide rate can be reduced, the suicide rate can be reduced, to bring them more in line with machetes and hammers is part of the objective. You're not going to stop people, much the same way you mentioned that you're not going to stop somebody determined to commit suicide. You're not going to stop a homicidal individual from finding the means to do that. However, you can impede their ability by impeding their access to the firearm. If, the argument that criminals will still be criminals, yes, they will indeed. But the reason you have laws defining what is and what isn't a criminal act is to have a line in the sand to say, okay, you've made the choice to acquire that gun illegally. You've made the choice to sell that gun illegally. That's trafficking.
So if that's what you want to do, you need to change the Second Amendment.
No, you don't. No, that's trafficking.
You just use the word impede instead of infringe.
Well, you're well regulated means just that. You're regulating the trade.
Infringe.
No. Well regulated means regulating the trade. It's commercial.
Infringe.
That is. No. Look at what the Constitution says.
Let me give you the definition of infringe.
But look at the definition.
Act so as to limit, undermine something, or encroach upon.
Look at the section in the Constitution that deals specifically with the authority of Congress, and the authority of Congress deals with the commercial trade of goods. They have that authority, so they have the authority to review.
They don't have the authority to infringe upon.
They have the authority to review. They have the authority under the law to disqualify those individuals. That's already established. Why are we arguing? If you're a criminal, you can't. If you're a felon, you can't acquire a gun, right? We have if the 40% of transactions that go forward are not being background checked. We have currently 11.4 million that have gone through the ATF. That means if you apply the 40%, there's 19 million firearm transactions a year. So that means there's 7.6 million transactions that are not getting the scrutiny of a background check. That's 3% of all of the weapons in the country, all the firearms that are privately held in the country. That's a pretty significant number to not have any scrutiny. That's not infringement. That's just simply scrutiny.
Again, a lot of this debate wouldn't exist if the politicians would do the proper procedure. And I'm just reading the Second Amendment the way I read it.
Right.
I'm not saying it's still accurate for today.
Okay.
But if you wish to update it or change it in some form, there's a procedure to do it. Simply follow the law, follow the procedure, and do it correctly.
Right,
Don't pick and choose what you're going to change and not change from administration to administration.
But there's no need to change it. There's no need to change it. There's nothing being proposed that infringes upon the Second Amendment. It is the interpretation of the Second Amendment which is faulty, that people are acting under. The Second Amendment is quite, it's vague, but it's quite clear in what it means, and if one reviews the court decisions with relation to it, you know, we have had for 70 years a restriction on fully automatic weapons. At the same time, an individual can acquire a fully automatic machine gun. They just have to go through a much more regimented process of licensing, and it involves fingerprints and a registry and all the things that are big bugaboos at the moment. But there hasn't been a single issue arise from that in 70 years. There's a lot of public relations smoke and mirrors taking place to cover the fact that people are making a tremendous amount of money selling what could be classified as military arms, which is, you know, that's part of the, you know, it's no different than selling cigarettes or selling liquor. The only difference is that it was the middle and upper class that were buying the liquor. That's why the prohibition for it. You know, firearms are something that are available to the poorest people in the country, and as a result, we have areas of Chicago where you've got in very small areas of Chicago, but where you have firearm fatalities running at 19 per 100,000. But then you've got St. Louis, or not St. Louis, New Orleans, where it's running at 42 per 100,000, and the highest death toll firearms in the country are Louisiana and Alaska. Even taking into account Chicago and New York and all these other high crime
areas. Of which are overwhelmingly owned by illegally owned.
Well, not necessarily. Not necessarily.
The overwhelming majority of it.
You know, you talk about current laws. One of the issues that on the let's get things sorted out side of this debate is there are a number of riders that have been put in place on various bits and pieces of legislation, which pretty much tie the hands of the ATF on doing their job and interfere with the CDC researching issues like suicide and the rest of it. When you mention firearms, there's a bunch of things, a bunch of roadblocks put in the way of just simply administering and regulating, if you will, the activities surrounding firearms. I'm not quite clear on why there is concern over a registry and licensing. We talked at the beginning of this, the idea of having a license. And, as it happens, as I said at the opening of this, I happen to be in Canada. I no longer need it, but at one time I had a firearms acquisition license, a photo ID, no different than a driver's license, with my picture and complete description on it, and was registered with the federal government. And at the time, I was handling the various firearms I needed to handle for the purpose that I was handling them. And no issues there. Nobody coming and knocking on the door and trying to take anything away. It was part of my work. It was no big deal. I find the paranoia about the idea of I understand the expense of it, but I find the paranoia uncalled for. Going back to the sale of your firearm to your neighbor, it's a commercial activity, and that's regulated under the Constitution. It's not an infringement. It's Congress doing what it's entitled to do.
So your issue is the secondhand sales of firearms.
My issue is any commercial transaction. It just needs the scrutiny of the background check. I don't, you know, who would do the background check eliminates and not. That's all part of other discussions. But the scrutiny of the background check, it's a few-minute submission of a social security number and a name and an address and a date of birth, and you know, it doesn't necessarily even need to identify what the particular firearm is. It's just that so and so wants to buy a firearm. And are they somebody who shows up in the system?
I don't disagree with you. Right. All I'm saying is that the way the Second Amendment's written, it should be updated to fit what you're saying. Background checks, licenses, all of these different. What defines mental health? What defines felon?
Okay, but
all of that should be updated.
No, okay, but let me suggest to both of you that you take the time, go to the Cornell University website, Cornell Law website, and and read the Heller decision. It's not very long. It's relative. Read Justice Scalia's decision, and he's very clear. And that's the current constitutional state. And you'll see that it addresses specifically that. It's not. I'm not speaking out of the side of my head. I'm speaking based on what I understand the Heller decision and Scalia have said, and bearing in mind that the subsequent decision in Chicago in 2010 applied the 14th Amendment, so it's now applied across the country. And that's the premise. That's the basic premise. Because I mean, the militia aspect of the Second Amendment, for all intents and purposes, is just part of the overall discussion as to what is and what isn't allowed as a particular firearm.
How they should be limited.
Well,
one way or another. If it's by a license, by regulation, define mental health. They don't get it. If you have an issue, felon. I can tell you right now, sometimes there's often issues when someone commits a felony in one state, other states aren't aware of it.
Well, that's part of the problem is we've got all these impediments in place that don't need to be. They're making our law enforcement, and generally speaking, our crime level, partly because our generation has now reached maturity and the baby boom is actually retiring. So the crime being committed by a specific age group, that sort of under 30 crowd, we're 30 years past that at this point, 20 or 30 years past that. So that's part of the equation, and one of the reasons why there's been a dramatic drop in crime. One of the other reasons there's been a dramatic drop in crime is that cities like New York and Chicago and other law enforcement agencies have become much more effective at targeting various events and keeping them. Their clearance rates on homicides are pretty impressive. Their clearance rates on the theft of cars is appalling. But the priority is on violent crime, as it should be. And it's basically, in my mind, it's a case of changing. And I think, John, this addresses part of where you want to see things go, is that we kind of need to change the cultural perception. And I've got no issue with somebody going to a target or shooting range and engaging. If they want to fire off machine guns, and that place is equipped with such and licensed to store such things, if that's how somebody gets their kicks, more power to them. That machine gun, however, shouldn't ever leave the confines of that particular location. Personally, I think that's the solution that, with respect to the enthusiasm for specific design enhanced firearms that are currently subject to all kinds of debate. There's a handful of them that, just restrict them in a similar fashion to this is the environment they're appropriate for, because 50 rounds is not necessary for taking down a deer, and we're not going to have many geese if you start applying it to duck hunting and geese hunting.
But going in the hunting category is
there's no issue.
It's self-defense. Well, I'm not afraid of a duck.
You're not afraid of a duck, and the reality is rifles are not used for self-defense. 85% of the justified homicides that are private citizens defending their home are done with handguns. And they'll pretty much use whatever they have access to. If they own a rifle, they'll use a rifle to defend themselves. No, I understand that, but the reality is that in the 5 years following the expiry of the assault weapons ban, there was a total of 50 out of what would be about 1,500 justified homicides by private citizens. There were only 50 that were performed with a rifle of any kind, and a few less that were performed with a shotgun. So the predominant defense weapon is a handgun, which is the perception of the Supreme Court. That's why the Heller decision went down the way it did. It was a limitation on the handgun, which the court held as a man should be issued a license and allowed to have for self-defense. And that's the whole debate over what happens with the rifles. I will agree that the events of Sandy Hook are likely rare, although they are increasing in frequency. But why give the guys the opportunity to be able to kill more people more quickly? That doesn't make sense.
I'd like to add a couple points. So, Ron, you talk about the Second Amendment, and Peter, you made the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And so the letter of the law is pretty clear, but the spirit of it, in my opinion, is to keep people safe. That was the idea behind the Second Amendment, is that we think this amendment is going to keep people safe. Now, if it's been proven that under certain circumstances this amendment is not making people safe, in fact, it's making life more dangerous for other people, then I don't think we need to change the Constitution entirely. I think we can make reasonable regulations about who can get a firearm. And again, the key word is reasonable. Majority of people are not going to be dangerous to begin. The question is, who's dangerous? What can we do to prevent that? And for the record, I think we have to do more than just write a few laws. And when it comes to who determines what the mental health is, the mental health issue, I would say it has to be a legitimate diagnosis from a licensed psychologist. Now, to become a psychologist, you have to do 5 years of grad school, and then you have to spend a lot of years getting licensed, getting consultation. So by the time you're a licensed psychologist, you have already had a lot of training with all of these. So if you make a diagnosis, then it's legitimate. Now, I don't think it should be one person's word. That's why I think we should do a sequential, as Peter said, a sequential series. But when it comes to determining who has a mental health issue, I think that should be relatively easy. It can't just be anybody saying it. It's got to be a licensed psychologist. And I would say even psychologists, because psychiatrists have a medical degree. They're not necessarily trained in psychology. And so I think if we do those two, I think it'll prevent at least some of the violence that we see. Not all of it, clearly.
And I would suggest
Agreed,
that
some of it.
Yeah. Well, the whole premise here, basically, Ron, is if we've got 30,000 firearm-related deaths, if we could reduce that by a third, that would be a pretty significant reduction. And it involves a wide variety. Mental health is only one element in it. It's not crime is an element in it, education is an element in it, access to firearms is an element in it. It's a wide array of issues. The fact is the country's awash in something over 300 million firearms in private hands, as many as 320 million in the country overall at the moment is the last number I just saw. What I was going to say, John, is that that it still has to be subject to appeal.
I agree totally.
There's got to be a system that allows an individual the opportunity to appeal decisions, and perhaps that to even be applied to the basic background checks. I, for one, would like to see the criteria of background checks enlarged somewhat, more in an effort, because about 10% of the fatalities related to homicide are related specifically to the domestic violence, murder-suicide issue. The majority of women that are dying at the hands of an intimate partner or a family member. And you start eliminating that, you start shaving down on that 8,500 firearm-related deaths by a couple of thousand, and you've made a significant impact. Gentlemen, I have to get myself organized for something else and take my leave. I very much appreciated the conversation. This is, other than our little bit of a spat over the Second Amendment, Ron, this has been one of the more...
I read it the way I read it.
No, and you're more than entitled to do so. But I do invite you to go. The Cornell Law page, the Cornell University Law, has a very good archive of legal cases, and it's fairly easy to access. If you Google Heller Supreme Court decision, you ought to be able to find it. It's just very clear and very quick access, and it just helps. It helps to have if we're all speaking from the same language. Anyway, I'm gonna have to to leave, Ken is asking for the two of you to carry on your conversation, and I suggest that you do. I look forward to another opportunity to speak to both of you. Thank you.
Okay.
Take care.
Good talking.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, so just to clarify, for you, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like there's a difference between your personal beliefs and then what there is in the Constitution.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I don't disagree. I've made that point in other forums. Not here. This is my first time. But I said there's a difference between my personal beliefs and what I think the government has the authority to do. And so I also agree that the Second Amendment should be updated. But the problem is, and I think why there's a little bit of desperation is because the NRA is so powerful, and that there are, in terms of Congress, the makeup of Congress right now, there's no chance for a constitutional amendment to get passed. But there's a slightly better chance to get legislation passed. So that may be, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, that may be one of the reasons why there hasn't been a push to change the amendment, but there's been more of a push to propose certain gun laws.
I do believe that some portions need to be, I guess the word would be modernized, to bring it up to date. It is a couple hundred years old, so things need to be updated from time to time. The question is the procedure to go about that legally, and then they can battle out, in Congress, the precise wording as to the modernization of it. Here, they don't even mention firearms; they just say arms. So, it can be a whole world of different things.
Right.
The issues of mental health can pop up in a second. So I agree with what you were saying about the psychiatrist or psychologist. That's fine, but typically people have issues long before they're ever diagnosed.
Right, and actually, that's one of my main arguments. If you remember what I said, I think the conversation should be about how to reduce gun violence. And actually, I wrote a blog post about this. I think we should spend more energy on education, and we have a serious problem in the terms of access to mental health professionals, and that's a serious problem in this country that we need to address, because if we spend more time, if we put more money into that, if we train more mental health professionals, I think that's going to be more effective at preventing these gun deaths than a few laws. And I'm under no illusions that no matter how well we regulate it, if people want a gun, they're going to get a gun. But we can make it a little harder. And if the focus is on providing the help, I think that's a better direction than just writing laws saying you can't get a gun.
But and then it goes back to, again, the law of the land. The Constitution is the highest law of the land. Any other laws trying to circumvent the Constitution, null and void, in my opinion.
Okay.
So a secondary law cannot subvert a constitutional right. The way the Constitution is written, again, I'm not a Supreme Court justice, it says that my right to bear arms, and it doesn't define arms as guns or firearms, shall not be infringed upon.
Right.
If he wanted to use the word impede or regulate, I'm sorry, it's wrong, according to the way it's currently written. If you want the Second Amendment changed, then go through the procedure to do it.
System of checks and balances. Right.
They can get into the issue of how to go about it.
Right. And so, but there's remember, there's a system of checks and balances. Congress can write any laws it wants to. It doesn't necessarily have to be constitutional. If someone thinks it's unconstitutional, there's also a process for that, and then it goes to the Supreme Court, and then it's up to the Supreme Court to decide based on the letter of the law and also law.
It's one minor thing that you're forgetting. You are correct. if someone is arrested and and they wanted to take it, they need a whole lot of money to get that court battle all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the average person doesn't have that kind of money.
Right.
So,
but in terms of,
it's cheaper to go out and get the $50 license than it is to pay.
But, right. Okay, good point. But what I would say is that
it does need to be updated. The whole issue with the machine guns.
So I didn't catch that last part.
It does. When you get into the whole other issue of machine guns, how come they're, regulated and whatnot. Okay, but again, it goes back to the verbiage of the Second Amendment. If you don't like the way it's currently written, here's part of the problem. Part of the problem is, as presidents come and presidents go, of whatever party they are, they swore an oath to uphold, from foreign and domestic threats, the Constitution.
Right.
The problem is, when they pick and choose which parts of the Constitution they're going to uphold, thereby ignoring the others, and then the next president comes along and does the opposite, you can't do that. You swore an oath to uphold the entire Constitution. If you don't do that during a time of war, that can be considered treason.
Okay, so I'm not disagreeing.
You swore an oath. You have to do it.
I'm not disagreeing. I think the problem that we have is literally just how we interpret the Second Amendment, and how I read it, and how other amendments have been treated, is that there can be limitations on it. That's all I'm saying. That in my view, based off of
logically, I agree with you.
Right.
My head agrees with you, but when I read it, and again, it's 200 years old. Should it be modernized? Probably.
Yeah.
But the way it's currently written, any infringement is just that. It's an infringement.
Okay. Again,
perhaps it should be updated.
Perhaps it should, but again, I don't think it needs. I think we're arguing in circles here. Is that how it's written? I don't think it needs to be updated. And like I said, the First Amendment states Congress shall make no law regarding infringement of free speech. Well, I don't know the exact word. It says very clearly you can't infringe the right, you can't limit free speech. But we do. We do, and no one has a problem with that. And
some people do.
Some people do. Okay, but and again, I understand what you're getting. So what you're saying, and my argument is you're looking at a literal interpretation. I'm looking at the spirit of that amendment, and
the problem with looking at the spirit is it can change from interpreter to interpreter.
Well, exactly, and that's why we have.
So that's part of the problem.
That's why we have the branches of government to determine how far does the law go. That's all that I'm saying is that I don't think it unconstitutional, even with the way that it's written. I don't think it unconstitutional. Make reasonable regulatory law. That's me, and I understand you disagree, and that's perfectly fine. That's my view is we can make certain reasonable regulatory law. That's it. And you've obviously disagreed, and that's okay.
Okay. I think it's time to take off and take care of some other things.
All right. Well, me too. I really. So
now I'll give.
I liked your point of view on a lot of things. I appreciated your perspective.
There's a different thing between logic and being level-headed, which pretty much I agree with a lot of what you said.
Yeah.
But it goes back to the black and white that's written on the paper.
Right.
If you can't pick and choose, you just either update it or follow it the way it's written, one or the other.
Okay. All right. Fair enough.
But I hope everybody takes a minute to go to the RepublicanPartyHistory.com. I gotta give it a shameless plug.
Okay.
It's a book my son and I wrote.
Oh, okay.
By him. He wanted to know about the history, so it turned out to be pretty interesting.
That's all right.
Have a good day.